My apologies. I can be heard now, I hope. Our mission at Protocol is to cover the people, power, and politics of technology. Welcome to this event, our first of two during the 2020 National Political Conventions. We believe that technology is no longer just an industry. It's a global power center with the sweep and impact of any nation's capital. And today we find ourselves in a very complex landscape. A health pandemic, millions of Americans out of work, continued racial inequalities, and capital markets at an all-time high. There is no doubt that the role of tech at this moment in history is greater than it's ever been before. Protocol is excited to partner with the Global Trade Association of the Tech Sector, ITI, to bring to you these two events. Next Wednesday, we'll focus on the role that technology infrastructure and innovation play in our economy. But today, we focus on what it will take to build a diverse and inclusive workforce. We'll have two panels. Our first with tech company leaders, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues, Issie Lapowsky and Emily Birnbaum, with a policy and political conversation. Right now, please welcome Jason Oxman, the president of ITI, to help set the stage for this moment in history. Jason, welcome.
Well, thanks, Tammy. It's great to be here with you, and we are excited, thrilled to be partnered with you at Protocol on this important event and this important dialogue. As the Trade Association of the Technology Industry, we're proud to represent the world's most innovative companies. And as you noted, an industry that is powering our economy and a positive force in our lives. You know, we've certainly seen during this pandemic the vital role that the technology industry plays in our ability to work from home, to host events like this and important discussions, for our children to learn from home, for all of us to access telemedicine and our doctors and other crucial aspects of our lives. So this discussion of tech policy is very timely and very important. We're absolutely thrilled to be partnered with Protocol on this. Protocol is the thought leadership outlet for the policy industry. And we think of ourselves at ITI as the thought leaders of technology policy. So it's a natural fit for the two of us to be working together, and we're delighted to have the opportunity to partner together on this important topic. Today, we talk about a diverse future workforce. And next week, we talk about enabling the economy of the future through technology, two very important subjects. These are indeed the fundamental policy issues of the day. Also this week, we actually published our tech policy roadmap. So our discussion today on the importance of diversity in the tech workforce and our discussion next week on building the future economy are actually very timely discussions given our release of that document. It's called Building the Future, Tech Policy, the platform for 2020 candidates in this election season. We obviously think it's incredibly important for politicians of both parties to be talking about tech policy issues. We're focused on 4 issues that we think should be key components of any party's platform, of really any candidate's platform in this election. First, we're talking about education and opportunities for all Americans to ensure a diverse workforce, the topic that many ITI member company experts will be talking about with you in just a few minutes. Now, this is focused on STEM education. It's focused on high-skilled immigration, other ways we can ensure an important, diverse workforce. The second issue we're focused on in our tech policy platform is ensuring a global market for goods and services. That is to say, a focus on global trade, a focus on tax policies that support innovation, recognizing that we are a global marketplace for innovation and technology. The third topic we're focused on in our tech policy platform is America's technological and innovation edge. We want to make sure that the public sector at all levels is invested in the digital infrastructure of the future. We need to address our digital divide. We need to make sure we focus on sustainability and the growth of the internet. And fourth, we want to make sure that all Americans have a trust in technology and the reliability of infrastructure. So this is focused on privacy policy, on cybersecurity, trusted supply chains, and the future of innovation in AI and technology. So across all of these topics, we think it's really important that we have a robust discussion. Our partnership with Protocol allows us to do that, and we appreciate your team and the great discussion we're going to have today and next week and into the future on these important tech policy issues.
That's great, Jason. Thank you so much. And you laid out in building the future, 4 different areas that you're asking candidates during this election season to really focus on. And the one for today, I think, is critically important, which is why of the 4, this week we've really focused on building that diverse and inclusive future. So thank you, Jason, for the partnership. We look forward to the conversation and for putting tech as the power center that is really influencing the landscape. So thank you, Jason. With that, I want to turn to this conversation around diverse and inclusive workforce and welcome 4 technology leaders from 4 different technology companies that are here with us today. So first is Danny Gilroy, Head of Diversity and Inclusion from Dropbox.
Hi, Tammy.
Oh, perfect. Welcome, Obed Lusaint, VP of Human Resources at IBM. Kristen Titus, Executive Director of Cognizant's US Foundation, and Tacey Trowbridge, the Lead for Education Programs at Adobe. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. We've talked a lot about at Protocol that technology companies' growth rely really heavily on an innovative and talented workforces. And in the past years, and certainly in the past several months, since the death of George Floyd, we have seen tech companies in particular make statements of support for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But as a whole, we know that our industry, and I come from that industry in tech, is often lacking on tangible results. The people that we have with us in this panel are really dedicated to changing that landscape, particularly in tech. And so would love to start in the conversation, Danny, with you at Dropbox. This is a conversation that you live and breathe. And let's start first with the last couple months. What has changed the most in terms of your work to support particularly inclusion with the Dropbox team in this conversation?
Sure, and thanks everybody for joining. I think I'll talk a little bit about what has and what hasn't changed. I think the piece that has changed since the most recent events over the last few months has been the desire to really engage in deep education and understanding about the Black experience in the United States. One of the things that we ended up doing, because we were trying to get away, we had to respond like everyone else did in terms of what the perception of the public is, in terms of companies' stances and positions. But it was really important to us to do something that was impactful and meaningful, because what I would ask our people within Dropbox, our team members, is are people still going to be interested 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, and do the work that's really necessary to understand in depth what needed to be done. And so we put together a program based on the principles of the process that took place post-apartheid in South Africa, called a Truth and Reconciliation Program, where we've covered a number of different, and we are covering over a 6-month period, a number of different major policy issues, and having speakers, poets, artists, and different experiences, all culminating in a workshop at the end where people will refer back to things that they've learned about policing, about the history of education, health disparities, resistance, take all of that and then determine how to act. One of the things that we've told people is to slow down a little bit for a minute and reflect versus just acting to act. Think, be meaningful, and be thoughtful. 2 other things that I'll just mention real quickly that I think are really important is that that's in response, but what's also happened is that it has, I think, increased the attention to some things that were already underway at Dropbox. So one thing that I think I've talked about a lot, and that a lot of people talk about, is for technology companies, if we want to have a more diverse workforce, one of the things we have to do is not just hire in Seattle, San Francisco, and New York. And so one of the things that we're embarking upon at Dropbox is a new distributed hiring strategy, where we're looking at potentially sourcing from other markets, because obviously the population looks different in Atlanta, in North Carolina, and in other places than it does in San Francisco proper, where depending upon the numbers you look at, Blacks make up between 2.5 or 4% of the total population. The other thing that I'll just say is a focus on who we have internally already and making sure they have a positive experience. So one of the things we're starting to do is use predictive analytics to identify women and underrepresented minorities who, based on historical factors, might be at risk of leaving the company, and have developed specific retention plans for them that we're tracking over time to see how we can have an impact. So I think what it's done is it's given us an opportunity to play a little bit in the mindset that people have about diversity. And it's also helped people to double down and focus on what some existing opportunities are that we have on the table and take them with a new level of urgency and seriousness.
That's great. I want to ask, because I want to come back to the pipeline conversation in just a minute, but when you talk about kind of taking a breath, Danny, and thinking about kind of the long-term piece, is one of the pieces that we think about, and I'm interested in how you continue to keep the momentum that I feel like this moment has given us on this topic. How do you think about that in Dropbox in terms of ensuring that that in 6 months that this is still front and center, and clearly that's your role, but how do you think about bringing people along in that?
Yeah, so how I've tried to approach work in diversity is a lot of times people will approach this work in an event-based way. They'll want to do something, do a thing, versus thinking of it as outcome-based and a change management process. So whenever we do anything, we don't say, let's just do something. I usually have to step back with people and ask, what are the objectives that you see that you want to accomplish? And then what are all the steps involved in that? So just to give you a real example of what that looks like, one of my team members who manages our employee resource groups said, I'd like to do an employee resource group fair to get people excited about ERGs. I said, I think that's a great idea, but what is it you really want to accomplish? And he said, well, I want more people to join ERGs. I said, okay, well, this is just an event that is kind of like a launch party. And what we need to talk about now is everything that we're going to do so that 6 months from now, you have more members than you do now, because this launch party isn't going to do it by itself. And so what we tried to do is get really strategic and thoughtful about any activity we're engaged in, and thinking of it with a change management mindset, and looking at events as just different touch points and experiences, all leading to some outcome. I think that's the kind of discipline that this kind of work takes, and that we haven't necessarily had, because people want to have their fruit and their dessert, but they don't want to have their vegetables all the time and do the hard work of org change at the same time.
That's a good analogy that would work in my house. Obed, talk to me. You have been at this work at IBM for close to 20 years. You've seen lots of different groups. Tell me what's changed the most for you in your work over the last couple of months, and what you've been able to do.
Sure. Much like I'll start much like Danny, is that this has been this is part of who we are. It's part of our DNA, right? And long before the pandemic and also the murder of George Floyd, we have really been driving, looking for closing social injustice through creating opportunity or creating pathways to good jobs. So I think of our P-TECH initiative, which we started with a number, which is pathways to early college, high schools, right? Which we started with 600 partners around the world, where it's 6-year high schools that is really dedicated to serving underserved communities and in building schools so that it can help to diversify the whole tech industry, so all individuals in STEM. Also, apprenticeship programs, right? Working with 40 like-minded organizations through the Consumer Technology Association to really build pathways for mid-career and early workers into some of the hot new jobs in tech, and making a real modern form of apprenticeships. So it's about meeting people where they are, whether it's introducing them into STEM world, or midway through their career is skilling or reskilling so that they can have an opportunity or a pathway to good tech. or whether it be, so the one way is pathways, the other is thinking about skill first hiring, right? So we think about the talent rather than the credentials, right? So individuals who are passionate and curious around technology, and in helping to really focus less on degrees and the bias that comes with those, but really focus on skills. And that has enabled us to introduce a whole new way of thinking about our hiring. So now 15% of our US hiring is considered what we call new collar hiring, which are individuals who do not have traditional degrees, right? So, or who do not have degrees at all. So these are, this enables a more inclusive tech organization. And the last thing that I'd mention is our ongoing philosophy around this is also around policy, right? We engage where policy makes a difference, and whether that is the Equality Act, whether that's a permanent solution for DACA that is around looking at the Higher Education Act, and then also in police reform. So where it makes sense to help to diversify the whole system and meet people where they are is really important. In the last couple of months, what has changed the most has really been, we started right after the incident to stop, pause, and listen. And we started a listening tour, and we had 29 fabulous sessions over the course of a week time with our most senior leaders of the Black community and our senior management to listen to over 2,500 employees who just told their stories. They told their stories of incidents that happened outside of the organization and inside the organization. And it helped us to learn and to sharpen our pencils on our actions. So before responding with just immediately, here's what we wanted to do, we wanted to pause and listen. And then that helped us to then say, there are some things that we thought that we were further along than we were. And then we backed up and then said, around whether it's transparency of data, and then in helping and in thinking about data as sharing it to activate communities. It was around, scaling our activities. So we said, and, we were making progress on our PTech initiatives and hiring of interns, but then we said we were going to double down. So we said we're going to do 10 times the number of internships in order to drive more, adoption and give pathways to key jobs. We were going to diversify our supplier network, and that we were going to double down and use our prowess in technology to then lead technology for good. And then we also doubled down on our social justice policy advocacy. So that listening tour then helped us to say there are 4 areas that we wanted to even double down even further, and then co-create that with our constituency groups to then make the most, to have the most impactful next several years, right? So as Danny said, it's not about the next couple of months, but it's about years to come to make systemic change so that we may be able to create a more just environment that we all want to live in.
Thank you. You spoke a little bit about skills and capacity in terms of bringing new people and diverse pipeline into our tech companies. Kristen, as the head of the foundation, you spend a lot of time and resources out in the community. Will you talk to us about how you and Cognizant are thinking about that from the youngest ages in terms of the interaction with our education system to drive the diverse workforce?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having us here. I think much like Obed and Danny, Cognizant represents a diverse workforce of 300,000 people in over 60 countries. And D&I has been in our DNA from day one. And I think what we've mobilized in recent months, but really in the last 10 to 15 years, speaks to this very strategy. And I'll start with a couple things. One, the foundation was created 2 years ago with $100 million to tackle this very issue head on. And we think building a diverse workforce and retaining a diverse and equitable workforce requires a very intentional investment strategy from kindergarten to career. And with those $100 million, we've already invested 40 in less than 2 years, really focused on building the pipeline in the K-12 system. How do we increase access to computer science education? How do we ensure that every student, no matter their zip code, has equal access to the educational content that propels them into 21st century jobs? All the way up through career, how do we support educational and workforce training programs that effectively train someone for what we know the jobs of today and tomorrow will be? And that's taken many forms, but what it requires of all of us here is industry, companies to come together and chart a future for what the future workforce will look like, how we effectively prepare them for the jobs that we know we need today, and how do we help realign an education and training workforce across the United States to do that. Of those investments to date, I'll give you a few examples. For instance, we're working with the largest teacher training program across the country to equip schools, elementary, middle, and high schools to actually deliver computer science education to the hardest and highest need schools. We're working with organizations that are taking individuals in their high school careers, those with 75 to 90% free and reduced lunch, so high need communities, and giving intensive computer science education and then connecting them with those pathways into jobs, internships, job opportunities, paid work experience, to deliver them on a path to success. And a couple other quick call outs. One of our favorite organizations we're working with, CodePath, is an organization that really did this for the tech companies across the United States, built out an onboarding and training program for Facebook. They've now turned that on its head. They're working with 250 colleges across the country to reach the hardest to reach populations, those in rural communities, those at tier 3 and 4 institutions where most tech companies aren't recruiting, and delivering industry relevant computer science curriculum and placing them into jobs. And just to give you an example of what that yields, we're seeing Black students in this program 43 times more likely to land a software engineering role at a top tech company than their peers. It's big systems change work like that is really going to propel us into the future and ensure that no matter your background, you have equal access and opportunity to both the educational programs and pathways into jobs that really matter.
Thank you, Kristen. And Tacey, you have spent a lifetime and career on this as well for Adobe on, following up on Kristen's point around how are you all thinking about the skill sets, particularly the creative skill sets that Adobe is seeking? How do you build out a diverse workforce, particularly around those, and what have you all focused on?
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to join this conversation. I'm really honored to be here with these other panelists. The goal of my work at Adobe is to inspire and empower all students to be lifelong creators. And we think about that in a number of really important ways. We listen really carefully to what the skills that industry is looking for. We survey parents, we survey other students, we survey educators, policymakers to try to understand what are the important skills that students will need in order to be successful. And what we've seen is that creative literacy related to the understanding how to communicate, collaboration skills, skills around critical thinking, creativity, and we add creative problem solving to that. These are the skills that are in most demand. Educators want to teach these skills, students see them as valuable. And so our work has been focused on really building an ecosystem to make it easier for educators, for schools, for policymakers to support teaching these critical skills. We've been advocating for performance-based learning as one of the most effective ways to engage students and prepare them for a future where they likely will not continue to be taking standardized tests, but they'll need to actually solve problems, to analyze the world around them, to come up with new solutions and implement them. And so we've been excited to partner with a number of different organizations around this work, including Khan Academy. We created a set of resources this spring in response to the schools closing almost overnight to help educators prepare to teach distance learning. This was a crisis in the spring where schools were trying to figure out how to address the social and emotional needs of their students, how to address access and equity issues. I recently read a report by EdSurge where they interviewed a number of first-year teachers about their experience, and more than 3/4 of them had never been on a video call before they had to shift their instruction to online. So I think there are really important ways in which we can support educators in the short term. The access and equity issues are real in education, and we'd worked on solving some of those issues by trying to provide access in public places, in libraries, in labs, in coffee shops, all of which closed. And that just highlighted these issues that we hadn't solved, that we hadn't been able to ensure that individuals had access. I will say that access is insufficient, and I'll give an example from prior to COVID. I visited 2 schools in Los Angeles in the same day. One was a largely white school in Santa Monica where the students were working on a community-based problem. They had clients, this was an elementary school, they had clients they were working with, they were coming up with solutions, creating web pages, using technologies in ways that helped them solve problems. And the same day I visited a school in Watts in Los Angeles, predominantly Black and Latino school, where students, the access to technology that they were excited about, they had just bought the largest television that I had ever seen. And I think about the kinds of experiences that they both had access to technology, but what they were doing with the technology was so different. And our goal is really to move students from being just passive consumers of digital content, of digital media, to being creators, to making things, to using technology as tools that help them build and create the future. Part of the way we do that at Adobe is by supporting educators. We host the Adobe Education Exchange, a platform of almost 900,000 educators that provides learning content that helps educators see not just how to do distance learning or how to address social and emotional needs of their students, but how to teach these really challenging skills in an online format. How do you teach creativity and collaboration while students are working online? These aren't easy. Part of what we do is find the fabulous educators who are doing this work and try to tell their stories, to share their work with other educators. We create free professional development, free curricular resources, so that it's easier for educators to be able to teach the skills that we know really matter in the workforce. And then finally, we work with policymakers to advocate for the importance of performance-based learning and the role in which policymakers can play to help educators, whether that's through providing more professional development, providing funding and support for schools to be able to offer these kinds of learning experiences. And I think finally, one of the things that we're seeing really challenged, and I think in a good way, is the way in which we assess students. We have an opportunity now to rethink assessment, to think about performance, to think about portfolios, to think about ways in which we can help students tell their stories, and ultimately have a larger impact on the world that we live in.
Casey, thank you. Between the 4 of you, I'm struck, in some ways we started the conversation around how we build inclusive cultures within our own tech companies, right? Danny, you started really there around that piece and have moved down to the education system and what does that look like in terms of tech for our youngest students and how we build that pipeline. Danny, I'm interested in that side of it. I mean, a lot of the work that you talked about of sitting back and listening right now was very much about ensuring that your current team feels like this is a place that they want to be. How do you go out and signal that to the pipeline of folks that you're hoping will come and be part of Dropbox's team?
So it's a hard question that I don't think tech has entirely solved for yet, and neither have we necessarily. I think there are some, you start to get into the systems and how they work a little bit. So I think I already mentioned before locations and where I look. So I go to places where there are underrepresented groups and I will inevitably find more. So that's just basics, I think. When we get past that though, and when we get into the system and how recruiting works, and we're talking predominantly about technical jobs, okay, about engineering jobs and roles like that, then we have to look at how the system works and what we look for and what the levers are that start to narrow the funnel. So when you think of entry-level roles, for example, in CS, what happens is that certain schools sequence the computer science education in different ways at the university level. And so what happens is that when engineering graduates from an HBCU are taking a weed out GitHub test to submit code, they may not have had certain coursework that students at Stanford, MIT, and other places had a year beforehand, and so are eliminated in the process to begin with. So thinking about what I need to actually vet for and screen for to begin with is really important. Does that really make a difference 1 year from now in terms of somebody's performance? Or can I take somebody who may have the potential once they're here, even though their coursework was sequenced differently, or they may not have had something? So I think the first thing is starting to relook at what I think I need, because all of this is built on me trying to recruit myself. That's what happens, is that a lot of these founders in technology companies are essentially trying to recruit themselves. And that doesn't mean they look like them, but that means that they're qualified like them and think like them. So in addition to the locations that I look at, a second, I think, factor that I need to consider is what the criteria are. Other levers that I think are really important that we push people on thinking, in addition to location, in addition to hiring for potential and not just what somebody knows today, because what somebody knows today may not be what they need to know 6 months from now anyway. A third item that we ask people to look at is industry. A lot of times there's an industry bias. I need somebody who's done software work before. Well, every company is essentially a technology company today. Whether you're talking about Coca-Cola, they have a huge tech stack just like everybody else. And they're based in Atlanta. And so looking at industry, I think, is another lever that I need to look at. The other piece that I need to look at that's essential is, if I'm trying to do a new process, then inevitably, unless I have people who are conditioned to working in this way and recruiting in this way, it's going to take more time. So do I need to feel like I need to fill a role within 30 days? Or am I all right as we build a new muscle, taking more time to do something? Essentially, the hard work about diversity is that we don't own anything, okay? We play in everybody else's sandboxes. And so what you're doing is, as everybody's talked about, is working to convince stakeholders of systemic change that needs to take place and have them thank you for it afterwards, which is not easy. Sometimes you have partners who are willing to do it. Sometimes you have partners that are less willing to do it. That's really the essence of the work. And so I just gave you a few examples, but any organization can go back and unpack where things are. It's almost like being a CSI and doing a forensic investigation and seeing how we got to where we are, and then systematically changing and opening the funnel at each stage. And I gave you just a few examples, at least of some of them that we've looked at.
Hey, Tammy, if you don't mind, I'd love to jump in there, because I think you've got to be super clear, building on Danny's points, but you also have to be super clear on where you show up, right? So candidates in education systems are looking for where we show up, and then not only where our dollars are, but where our time is. So if, in talking about going to, really diverse colleges, and, we've got an HBCU program working with historically Black colleges and universities around where initiative where we're making $100 million of our software available to those HBCUs. However, it's the time that we spend on campus, or we bring them into our environment to help the faculty really understand some of the modern skills around blockchain and cloud and quantum and AI, and then helping them to get the most critical and digital badges that then they can teach their students, and then have their students compete for the real jobs. It's when we are on campus and we're mentoring, is through our PTech initiative, when we're sitting in the classrooms, well, now virtual classrooms, but with students, and then providing them internships and working with them over the course of the summer, that now it opens the aperture of the different types of organizations that they can now work with, because they have that critical experience. Or our most recent call for code, where we've invited individuals within our firewall and at the network at large to work on, to hack on 7 critical societal issues that focuses on inequity and injustice. When you are doing these things, that's how, and when you are spending not just your dollars, but your time, your energy, your mental and physical capacity in order to address these issues, I think that is the signal that our candidates and students are looking for organizations like ours to really show up.
Amy, let me just add one thing, one sentence real quickly, and that is that I just can't emphasize what Obed said enough. And it's not just money. I worked at Autodesk beforehand, didn't have anywhere near the kind of budget that you're talking about, Obed, but created a relationship with Howard University there. But it took 2 years before we got our first people there. I had to go there, I had to meet people, I had to talk to them, and they had to know that I wasn't just coming to hire a few people and leaving, that I was looking at this as a long-term relationship. And now we have now Autodesk has a regular pipeline of students from Howard coming through. We're doing the same thing now at Dropbox, but we know that these relationships take time. And sometimes the money is great, but it's the time and the relationship building that are essential. And if you have the money also, even better.
Kristen, how do you look at that from the foundation perspective, where you're investing money, you're building the relationships, but how does that relate to kind of what Cognizant then can see in terms of tangible hires?
Yeah, if I can take a step back, I think back to when I started this work nearly 10 years ago, and we were at a place in the tech industry where we actually didn't know the extent of this problem, right? Companies until 2012, 2013 didn't start releasing their diversity numbers, and that was when shareholders demanded it. I think, what I am so thrilled to see today, and certainly over the last 6 months, is the extent to which moments like the extremely tragic killings of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, they happen, but they don't happen in a vacuum. We now have a platform, a set of best practices, signaling, to your point. We have sort of a series of examples of what works, how to build on that, how to execute on that, and both employees internally and communities externally demand that. And I think I just see where we are today as nothing but opportunity. I think to your question about how Cognizant addresses this and how the foundation addresses this, when I look at where we are today, in today's landscape, you opened with the note of 40 million Americans filing for unemployment. We have companies that have completely removed jobs that will not be coming back. I think we have a true once in a lifetime call to action to map what the future of the workforce requires and how we build pathways into these jobs that are inclusive. For companies who used to your point, Danny, only recruit from 5 institutions and have an internship program of 200 students from those 5 tier 1 institutions, those were their entry-level hires. That's been turned on its head. We as companies have an opportunity now to rethink what are the functions of internships, where do we recruit from, how do we build equitable pipelines into those. And then just to echo what everyone here has said, I think we all have now a recognition that this is not about a one-off solution. There's not an easy plug and play, there's not a silver bullet. This is about systems change. So how do we take moments like this and how do we take programs and, to your point, 2 years of relationship building to demonstrate what works and drive change inside institutions like ours, across academic institutions, and really reframe what this looks like to build a 21st century economy. And Cognizant's work on this over the last several years has extended from the very earliest stages of intervention in K-12 all the way into workforce. And to your point about signaling, it's had a dramatic impact on how we look at talent, how we look at growth, how we look at the world around us. And I think everyone would agree that it's only when you have a diverse workforce, diversity of background, diversity of thought, diversity of ethnicity, that you can truly produce the best innovations, that you can truly produce the best technology, that you can truly envision a future that benefits all. And I think we're now starting to see the product of that.
Tacey, we have just a minute left. There's so many questions I want to dive into, but let's talk. I mean, we're here at a moment in time during our national political conventions. And if you think about kind of policy changes or policy things that you think, particularly on the education side, if you could all kind of go through, like, what are some of the pieces from a policy perspective that you hope might come in this time frame to help support the work that you all are doing?
Yeah, I think that this is, as folks have said, a real.
Each of you, go ahead.
Okay.
As folks have said, this is such a critical time for us to put long-term plans in play, that we've got a moment that spurs us, but it can't be just an event. And so thank you to Danny, to Kristen, to Obed for underscoring that, but I think that's critically important. Some of the policy changes are part of what allow us to make this kind of change at scale. And so I think there's some really critical things we need to address. One is access and equity, that we have to actually do that. And we have to think of that as beyond just, does someone have internet access? That's critical, but we also have to think about, do they have the kinds of tools, the kinds of capabilities in terms of the technology they're using that really allow them to create and not just to consume. So I think that's a critical piece. I also want to advocate for really thinking about our educational system and the way in which we prepare students for the future. We have an opportunity to think about giving them the kinds of experiences that are similar to the kinds of experiences they'll face as they go out into the world, in the workforce, as citizens. And so I think we need to think about educational change and reform that extends into assessment and the way in which we think about assessing and evaluating student work and making that assessment authentic, making it performance-based, ensuring that all students have the ability to show up in the best possible ways.
Thanks.
And then,
So I know you're running low on time, Tammy, so I'll say a Higher Education Act. I would say removing restrictions for use of federal dollars so that students can work off campus and mid-career workers can start to use those for things like apprenticeships and get into real pathways to good jobs.
Danny.
I'll say two real briefly. One that is easier, which is true supplier diversity initiatives that give people a true piece of the pie, driven at the governmental level. Some of the work that was done in the early 90s under Republican administrations actually really started to push the dominoes on this at the very beginning and got less aggressive over time. And so I think a return to that and even getting more aggressive about that would be great. The second one, which is more pie in the sky, and I know there's a lot of opposition to it, but reparations would be extremely powerful in terms of a recognition of the injustice that was done. When you look at 3 years of internment and the fact that we did reparations for Japanese Americans, which was totally justified, and we had 200 years of slavery 200 plus years of slavery for Black Americans, and it's never been acknowledged and recognized, both from a monetary standpoint, as well as from a spiritual and emotional standpoint, I think would be a huge step in terms of changing the dialogue about race in the United States.
I think that's a good place to end. Kristen, do you have any other policies?
Yes, if I can, two things, and I plus one everyone. I promise this will be quick. The first, CS education and K-12 system. If we were to see a real equitable future for all of our populations, absolutely necessary. Second, we have hundreds of millions of dollars of workforce funds in communities across the country. We as tech companies need to help realign those funds and allocation of those funds to train for the jobs of today and tomorrow. We really have a responsibility to step up there, and nothing but opportunity.
Thank you all. And a good piece to note, lots of policy opportunity here as well. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Issie and Emily, and my thanks to all of you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for sticking with us. That was a really fascinating panel. So thank you to all of our prior panelists. My name is Issie Lapowsky, and I am a senior reporter for Protocol. And I am joined today by Emily Birnbaum, who is our tech policy reporter at Protocol. We also have three really exciting guests, and we're going to talk about a lot of the issues that we discussed in the last panel, but also really hammer in and drill down on that policy side of the equation. First, we have Representative Jim Langevin of Rhode Island, who is one of Congress's top cyber experts. We also have Catherine Bracey, who is CEO of Tech Equity, which is an advocacy group in the Bay Area that is pushing for more equitable tech workforces. And before that, she served as the President Obama, I'm sorry, as his Tech Field Office Coordinator in 2012. And we also have Swathi Mailavarapu, who is founder of Insight.org, which funds mission-driven businesses and also some political candidates. And before that, she served as National Investment Chair for Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign. So before we start, if anybody has questions, just like the last panel, you can ask them in the Q&A box down below. And now I'll kick it over to Emily.
Hi, I think the Congressman is just tuning in. So I'm really excited for this panel today. Congressman, I wanted to start with you. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can all hear you great. Thanks so much. So Congressman, you are the co-chair of the Career and Technical Education Caucus. I know you spend a lot of time thinking about the future of our workforce and the future of our infrastructure. I just wanted to start off with sort of a general question. So, it feels like we're facing an inflection point right now when it comes to diversifying the tech industry, where there's a lot of talk about diversifying STEM and few commonly accepted action items as to how we can get there. So many people say that it's time for government intervention. So what are some of your top proposals, some of the things that you think are most compelling for improving the racial diversity of the tech industry through government intervention? What's the role of Congress?
So first of all, it starts with K through 12 education, making sure that our young people can see themselves in the roles of the future. So having the right mentors, educators in place that are modeling this this area and see them where they can see themselves in this role is really essential. Beyond that, improving representation at senior levels, say in the federal cyber workforce, by way of example, or the STEM workforce, if you will, with greater oversight on who is being evaluated for key jobs and positions, and what are the metrics. But starting with K through 12 education is obviously the most important thing that we can focus on.
I guess I wonder if you think it's time for government incentives to some degree. I know there are some members of Congress who have said maybe we need tax incentives, to diversify. Maybe we need laws, as there is in California, to ensure that you have diversity on your boards, starting from the top down. Do you think it's high time for really specific things like that?
Well, I certainly think that we need to do a better job of not only on the recruitment side, but then understanding where in the pipeline things break down. Because I think we're doing a better job at recruiting a diverse workforce, but not so much in terms of seeing people promoted through to senior level management positions, just by way of example. And so, we're looking at the Solarian Commission is right now planning to put out a white paper later this month that digs into some of the topics of where things break down in the pipeline in terms of recruiting and then moving people along to more senior level positions. And the upcoming white paper recommends basically an empirical study to understand again where during recruitment, hiring, and career progression do cyber professionals from underrepresented demographics fall out of the pipeline. So going back to kind of your previous question too, one of the things that I did in the National Defense Authorization Act is establish a scholarship for service pilot under the Department of Defense STEM education program for students at minority institutions. So there's already a scholarship for service program that services anywhere between 300 and 400 students, and certainly people from minority populations are not precluded from being in that 300 or 400 individual that group. But we want to have a greater focus on specifically recruiting people from minority populations to be they were traditionally underrepresented groups to be more specifically encouraged by participating in these scholarship programs. So we set aside $3 million specifically to go to historically Black colleges where students could participate in that type of STEM scholarship for service program.
Catherine, I wanted to turn to you because I think we've heard a lot today about STEM education and about workforce training. And what I think is really interesting about tech equity is you are not necessarily coming at this issue from that direction. You're not, running STEM courses for kids or retraining, out of work factory workers. In fact, one of your policies is that, reskilling is not enough. Instead, you're working on two really big bucket social issues, housing and contracting. So can you talk to me a little bit about where you feel that these STEM training and reskilling programs have failed in the past, and also why you're coming at it from the angle that you are?
Yeah, I think that we've been having this conversation for 10 years or so now and haven't made a lot of progress. And if anything, inequality is getting worse, especially in places where, the tech industry dominates the economy. So I think it's really important that, we start to really address the structural context in which these issues are manifesting. If we're only focusing on the internal hiring practices or retention practices or educational practices, or the pipeline or whatever, we're missing a lot. And I don't think we're ever going to get to sustainable solutions. So just like one example, we are, education funding. I've heard K through 12 mentioned several times in this panel, the previous panel. In California, we used to have the best public schools in the country 40 years ago. And then we passed a law that really created a distorted property tax system in the state, which has starved the state and primarily the public school system of hundreds of billions of dollars over the last 40 years. And now California is dead last in the country in teacher to student, librarian to student, and counselor to student ratios. And of course, that disproportionately negatively affects communities of color. So if we want to see investments in, universal computer science education, we've got to figure out how we pay for that, and we can't do it by letting rich corporate landowners exploit property tax loopholes and not actually pay their fair share. So there is a ballot initiative on the California ballot this year that would remove that loophole and raise $12 billion a year, 12 billion with a B, a year, 40% of which would go to public education. That would go a long way to helping us institute the kind of supports we need for students of color from underrepresented and underinvested in communities to actually get on-ramps into sustainable careers. Unfortunately, it's been really hard to get the tech industry to support that kind of structural change that we really need to enact the long-term solutions to this problem. And if they keep ignoring those kinds of issues and want to continue to invest in, coding camps or whatever, we're not gonna see the needle move. So I think we're at a moment in our country where people are recognizing that structural change is necessary and we have to invest in it if we want to live in the kind of world where we want to live in. And this is an opportunity for us to take advantage of that moment. And by us, I mean all of us, including tech companies.
That's a really great point. And Swathi, I wanted to bring you in here. So you're working as an investor now. You also just came off of a presidential campaign not long ago, even though it feels very long ago in pandemic times. But it occurs to me that the public perception of the tech industry was a lot different during the Buttigieg campaign and now during the Biden campaign than it was, say, when Catherine was working on the Obama campaign in 2012. There was just a different relationship and a different feeling of opportunity because we hadn't seen, to Catherine's point, all the ways that these coding camps and other things have failed to move the needle. So how do you think Democrats should be working with tech right now to build this inclusive workforce while also holding them accountable for all of the issues that we have seen come to the forefront over the last however many years?
Yeah, I mean, I think Issie, in your question, you perfectly phrase the tension. 11 years ago when President Obama was running for president, the tech industry was still very much a David relative to the American corporate giant, if you will. And that has really changed. I think, the silver lining on that is it's a testament to how transformative the products and the innovation are that have come out of this industry. The flip side of it is that with that kind of scale and reach and influence comes much more responsibility to be aware of sometimes the unintended consequences of what we put out into the world and the ways in which we run our companies. And so I think there's a real opportunity with the new administration in particular to have a much more nuanced conversation. And I, for one, as a member of the tech community, am also just very excited at the opportunity that a Harris-Biden administration in particular would bring to the table to push for and use both soft and hard policy levers to motivate our industry to catch up with the times in the national conversation. There's a saying in policy circles that personnel often are policy. And it's telling that, for example, with a Vice President Harris, we have a leader that has a long established career track record of surrounding herself with incredibly diverse and inclusive teams, of bringing a sort of nuanced lens and understanding of communities that are left out alongside of those that have built tremendous influence. I'm looking forward to the ways in which a new White House and administration will use their soft influence as well. So think about the opportunities to lead by example of having a cabinet that reflects the diversity of our country, a senior leadership team that reflects that diversity, and also using the symbolic position of the White House, for example, to cast a lens and ask questions of the tech industry. Who are the entrepreneurs that we highlight as great examples of leaders? Who are the ones that what are the questions that we ask when they're coming through for government and policy related purposes? So I think all of those exist. And then of course, also the executive branch has real potential to use incentives. So looking at funding, oversight, the kinds of powers that come within the executive branch. And then we get to the actual legislative piece. I think we're not just looking at change in the White House, but very possible and likely change in the legislative wings of federal government, so in the House and the Senate, and also in state legislatures around the country. And with that comes the promise of expanded worker protections, advancing the conversation on paid family leave, closing the gender pay gap, looking at reinvigorating the conversation around the Equal Rights Amendment. All of these are policy levers that are also probable and possible over the coming 2 to 4 years.
So I think this is a good place to ask Congressman. So Congressman, the 2020 Democratic Party platform includes relatively few mentions specifically of technology and cybersecurity issues. There's a section on privacy, there's allusions to antitrust, a promise to build up IT infrastructure. It also includes some of what Swati has been talking about building that more inclusive workforce, more protections for workers. I'm wondering, do you think it's a missed opportunity to not, for the Democratic Party to not be putting technology and tech policy more front and center? Do you think Democrats should be running on these issues, considering that these are the industries that are shaping the future of work that we're talking about? Wondering what's missing from the party platform.
Yeah, so I would, off the bat, I would say that obviously I didn't write the Democratic Party's policy platform, and so I would like to have seen more focus on technology and certainly cybersecurity, especially given the challenges that we've had since the 2016 election. And I think it is a missed opportunity to not focus more on that and articulate that this is a priority for our party, and that we're going to enact policies that advance what we think are the right tech policies going forward, including making sure that diversity is a forethought rather than an afterthought as we're expanding tech policies. So yeah, and hopefully in the future, that'll be more of a focus for future party platforms.
Catherine, I wanted to turn to you and see your thoughts on this. So we've just been through this, huge summer of commitments from tech companies. talking about how they're going to spend their money on racial justice and diversify their ranks. But as you said, sort of at the top of this discussion, we've been having this conversation for 10 years. So I wonder what you would say are the key actions that tech companies should take right now and investments they should make to actually move the needle on this. And then on the flip side, Swathi spoke to some of the policy proposals she supports. What are some of the policy proposals you would like to see coming out of the Democratic Party right now to move the needle on this?
Yeah, so I will say I focus more on state and local policy, so I'm not really able to speak to, what a Biden-Harris administration could or should do, or Congress. But, I think on the company side, there are a few things, and actually a few things that Danny said in the last panel that sort of raised a flag for me, one of which is this idea that, companies are looking elsewhere, other cities, to hire from or to set up offices as a tactic to diversify the workforce. And Atlanta comes up a lot. Atlanta happens to be the most unequal city in the country. And so as someone who lives in Oakland and has kind of been on the front lines of seeing what happens when the tech industry grows in a place that hasn't had a very resilient economy or inclusive economy over the last several decades and has suffered from real intentional underinvestment in communities of color, that makes me really nervous. And I totally get to where it's coming from, and I don't want to blame the industry, but I do think there needs to be a little bit more forethought before moving into places like Atlanta, where Georgia is not a particularly labor-friendly state. There are no kind of rent controls. If there's an affordability spike in Atlanta because more tech workers are moving in, or there's an influx of wealth, what happens to people who are priced out? Those are real questions. They're not theoretical because they're happening on the ground in Oakland right now. So I think that companies should be a little bit more thoughtful about engaging in those issues. I also think they need to really step up and support policy change. I loved that Danny said that, he wanted to see there to be structural change, but is the CEO stepping out and endorsing that? Is Dropbox stepping out and endorsing? We've asked several tech companies to endorse this corporate property tax proposal, which actually would benefit tech's bottom line. And they're very reticent to do so. So we need to see them start stepping out and supporting structural policy change. On the government side, I think it is, I know I just said all of that about what tech should do, but there's a real deep part of me that feels like we shouldn't be asking tech companies to lead the charge on these things, that, nobody elected Mark Zuckerberg to anything, and going to him and sort of forcing him to make the choices is really a dereliction of our democratic duty. And we really should be holding our elected officials accountable to instituting policy change that's going to help rein in these companies. And it's well within their ability to do so. So I think we should start putting more pressure on elected officials on that front. One thing that I'm really focused on is workforce and labor policy, including the fact that most workers in the tech industry are actually temps, vendors, or contractors, and they're not actually directly employed by the companies. And it's created this caste system within the industry that no one really understands, because when the companies are reporting their diversity numbers, they're reporting their full-time employees. They're not telling you anything about this wide workforce of people who don't have the same protections and benefits and perks that the full-time employees have. We need more transparency around that workforce, and we need to be creating better labor protections for all workers, including contractors, temps, and vendors. And it's not just enough to say make contractors full-time employees, because employment is not great in this country. So we need to figure out how we're actually supporting workers. To Swathi's point, paid family leave, I think we're going to see a real issue with advancement of women's careers right now, because the burden of having kids out of school for a year and a half is really falling on women. What are we doing about that? Why don't we have a safety net in place that's supporting workers in that sense? And so that's just kind of there are many other issues they could be working on, but I think the point is that companies have to be focused on the structural context in which they're growing their business and engaged on it, not scared of it. And regulators really need to be seeing that it's their responsibility to be a counterbalance to the power that's growing up in the tech industry.
Right. I love that, because I think so often when we see the tech industry wade into these waters, it is with the coding program, or it is with funding engineering programs, or whatever it might be.
Or press release a press release that they're donating to an organization instead of actually.
But there's a much bigger workforce who is affected by it. So, and Swathi, obviously part of building a more inclusive tech workforce has to include funding more inclusive tech companies, right? And that's what you do at Insight. And, you know, VCs like to talk about building a more diverse tech pipeline as if it's this elusive and unattainable thing. And we hear stories all the time about the crap that Black and brown founders have to go through. I will plug, Emily's has got a story on protocol.com about that right now, that these stories are just sort of mind-boggling about what people are going through just trying to get their businesses funded. So at Insight, your whole thing is funding a more inclusive workforce. Can you sort of demystify, for lack of a better word, how you go about finding and vetting diverse talent to fund?
Sure. So, I mean, my work at Insight is really focused on backing new values-driven leaders, including company founders. So we don't start with diversity as a search criteria, but I would say it's a design constraint for us. It's something that's woven into what we value. And what we found is we've made some incredibly lucrative investments. And if you happen to look at the demographic composition, you get a tremendous amount of age, racial, and gender diversity in our portfolio, way better than the industry average from my days on Sand Hill Road. And I will, you know, I'm a little bit channeling Catherine here, which is in saying this, but it's really not that hard. And the irony is that we're talking about a venture capital and a tech industry that are really in the business of solving much harder problems. That's, you know, we're ground zero for innovation in America. We do hard things. And the conversation over the last decade plus on diversity and inclusion, the great news about that is we've spent 10 years coming up with great ideas of what we can do to make sure that the companies that we're funding, the products and services that we're building, the teams that we're pulling together reflect the diversity of our country. So I think what we're really talking about is cultural change and whether or not there is buy-in and understanding from senior leadership at companies and from shareholders on the value of this. And the unfortunate reality of the growing inequality of our time is every single one of these stakeholders need to be treating equity in our industry and in our workforces like an existential and real problem. It's also a huge opportunity. And I think until we get that type of cultural change, everything else is a box checking exercise. We have hired the token women as LPs onto venture capital firms. We have, you know, I have worked in places that have industry leading numbers of women in senior ranks. And the factor that determines whether or not a company takes the extra steps to build a much more inclusive and representative workforce really has to do with whether or not, less about the gender composition of the team, I would say, and more about whether or not there is buy-in at the senior most levels that this work is important and valuable and to be prioritized. And so that's the kind of level of change that we're talking about. The unfortunate truth is it's not as easy as just hiring somebody and giving them a title. It's not as easy as having a really beautiful Instagram post in solidarity with the national moment. We're talking about real lasting change. And I think this is much more about building a learning mindset and cultivating a practice on how we get ever better here than it is about a single switched moment where people are bought in and change happens.
Thank you.
So I've got a question that doesn't pertain directly to the workforce, but you know, we are coming up on this really pivotal election season. You know, started obviously in kind this week with the DNC. And so Congressman, you know, you spend a lot of time thinking about election interference and how it's going to, you know, change our future. And so, you know, through your work on the Cybersecurity Solarium Commission, I know you've spent a lot of time working on this and specifically thinking about how election interference resulted in the disenfranchisement of Black voters in 2016, how, you know, messages were targeted directly at minority populations in order to sow discord in the US. And I really wanted to pose the question to you, you know, do you think that the US is better prepared to ensure that kind of targeting of minority voters does not happen again this election cycle?
Well, we're better prepared than we were in 2016. But I don't think we're out of the woods yet. And unfortunately, we have an administration right now that is doing everything they can, it seems, to suppress the vote, as opposed to making sure that every vote is counted. And look, you know, the right to vote is the foundation of our democracy, and we have to do everything in our power to protect that right. And so there has to be a focus both at the federal, state, and local level to ensure that occurs. Right now, I'm concerned about because we're living through this pandemic and an election, people being concerned about being in crowds, going to the polls in person. We should make it as easy as possible for people to vote in Rhode Island. Just by way of example, we had a requirement before, if you were applying for a mail ballot, that you had to have it either the application notarized or you had to have it signed by 2 witnesses. Our Secretary of State went to court and wanted to waive the signature requirement, the notary requirement, and federal judge approved that and went to an appeals court. They upheld the lower court decision, and then the Republican Party here in Rhode Island appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the lower court decision. So that's the type of thing that we need to see. I am troubled by the way of the actions of the Postmaster General, who was systemically dismantling sorting equipment, high-speed sorting machines, to make sure that ballots could be get through expeditiously and on time to be counted. You know, we've seen the pictures of the mailboxes that have been locked and are being hauled away so that there aren't as many of the blue, you know, post office boxes to mail your ballot in the first place, and then eliminating overtime. Now, thankfully, because of public pressure, the Postmaster General has done an about face, and he's saying he's not going to institute those reforms, those changes until after the election. We're going to put a pause on that, but that's not good enough. We need to do better. And it didn't say anything about if we're going to reverse the changes that the Postmaster General and Post Office has already put in place, like again dismantling the high-speed sorting machines. Nancy Pelosi, our Speaker Pelosi, is recalling us to Washington this weekend. I'll be traveling back on Friday for votes on Saturday to implement a bill that would require that the Postal Service maintain the same level of service that existed on January 1st of this year, right through to the end of this year, so we get through the election. But I am very concerned about voter suppression and other things that are going on around the country. Perhaps even things that we don't know about that are going to discourage people from going to the polls. We cannot let that happen, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that the vote is easy, accurate, and it gets counted. But by the way, this is something that's also important. I'll end on this. I know I'm talking too long, but we need to do a better job of building resilience into our democracy, and that includes civics education, digital literacy, so that you're questioning people. It becomes just ingrained that you don't just rely on news or information from one source, but you can scrutinize and fact check what you're seeing on the internet, for example, so that we get accurate information to people and that they can judge for themselves the truth of claims that are made on the internet, especially any attempts that are made to suppress the vote and discourage people from voting in the first place. And that applies to whether it's a foreign power trying to interfere with our elections, or whether it's domestic activities that are going on that are trying to suppress the vote. We need to be ever vigilant.
Well, thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists working from a lot of angles, to protect the future of our workforce and our country. I really appreciate all of you. We're unfortunately out of time, but please join us.
Before you end, I just do want to address Danny's question because he did put it in the chat. To clarify, I'm not saying tech companies should not hire in other places. I'm saying when they make the decision to do so, they should do so very consciously and understanding the context in which they're moving in. Just setting up an office or starting to hire without taking into consideration things like what are the labor laws in this place, things like what are the challenges that these communities are facing and how might we be able to mitigate them? How can we make sure that the growth that we're bringing to this place is responsible and inclusive growth is really critical. And frankly, a lot of tech companies are not having those conversations internally when they make these kinds of decisions. And we really would like to see more companies build that into their process as they think about when and how and where they grow. So Danny, I'm sorry if that came across as saying don't go places, but I'm just saying go, when you go places, go there consciously.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I look forward, I've reached out to you on LinkedIn. I look forward to chatting with you more. Yeah, absolutely. And those are things that we are thinking about in a pretty comprehensive way. So, but I do appreciate you bringing it up. And it's something we had some pretty robust discussion about in terms of trying to identify places and what to do and how we're going to show up and making sure we're consistent with our values. So thank you for bringing it up. I think it's a great point.
That's what we like to see. We hope that Catherine and Danny can have a really fruitful conversation and something productive comes of it. We wanted to make sure before we end to ask you to join us next Wednesday. We're going to keep talking about building the future. This time we're going to be talking a little bit more about the role of technology infrastructure and innovation and the role that they can play in our economy.